This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek, and we have covered the struggle of workers in the organization of the working class and unions here and around the world as part of our WorkWeek shows. And today we're going to be looking at the history of a working class organization in Britain, the SLL, Socialist Labor League, and Workers' Revolutionary Party, and also a group that supported it in the United States, the Workers' League and the Socialist Equality Party. And we're going to discuss that because in relationship to what's happening today with a fascist government, fascist movement in the United States, the danger of a tariff trade war and world war, a climate crisis, and a threat of mass deportations, the issue of the working class in this country and internationally is critical. And what is needed politically is part of that issue. What workers have to do to organize to defend themselves against the growing crisis, growing attacks on unions and on the working class as a whole. So I want to thank you all for joining us. And so I wanted to first introduce the guests on the show that we're having today. One is we're going to have Aidan Beatty, who is the author of The Party is Always Right, The Untold Story of Gerry Healy and British Trotskyism. He's a lecturer at Carnegie Mellon University. Also, Alex Steiner, he's a former leader of the Workers' League and a writer on the Workers' League and Marxism. And also Peter Ross, he's a former provisional member of the Socialist Equality Party and union activist. And Jerry Downing, and Jerry is a former member of the WRP, a retired bus driver, a unionist, and author of WRP Expulsion. So welcome all of you to our show. And we will give 20 minutes to Aidan, who's the author of this book, and then 10 minutes to the other guests. So welcome, Aidan, and glad you could make it to this panel.
Yeah, thanks a lot for giving me this chance to talk. So I'm going to talk mainly about the leader of those two parties, the Socialist Labour League and the Workers' Revolutionary Party, who's a man named Gerry Healy, who is well known within that world, but probably not that well known outside of the world of the SLL and the WRP and some of their affiliated groups. And I'll kind of use his life story essentially as the thread to talk about these different political parties and where they came from politically. His life story, in one level, in one sense, it's a story of violence, of scandals, of even sexual abuse, accusations that this organization was a cult, accusations that they were engaging in conspiracy theories, celebrities who, for various reasons, got involved. And then at the heart of all that is this one man named Gerry Healy, who has either been conveniently forgotten by people who were once some of his closest supporters, or in other cases, remembered in very negative terms. And his life story could be a very gossipy one, which wasn't the type of story I wanted to tell. But it is definitely a very emotional story for the people involved. But his life story is also, and I think more importantly, a story about Trotskyism, about the political tradition that both gave birth to Gerry Healy as a political activist, and which he also in turn helped to create and recreate. And I've come to see it as a kind of cautionary tale about the tendency that Trotskyism has often had towards schisms and personal animosity, and about what I see as the inherent flaws in so-called democratic centralist parties that often brook no dissent, and I think can even act as incubators for predatory people like Gerry Healy. In any case, in telling his life story, I'll start with what we definitely do know about him. He was born in Galway, a city on the west coast of Ireland, in 1913, and then he became a Trotskyist about 24 years later. Almost all the other important details that he would later recall about his childhood and early life were exaggerated, if not fabricated wholesale. He claimed to have grown up in very extreme poverty. His family actually owned a quite large farm of 103 acres in a country where anyone owning over 50 acres was considered a so-called strong farmer. He claimed that at age 6, he saw his father be shot and killed by the Black and Tans, which was an outright lie. And as can be heard in the few recordings made of him, his accent, which was mostly a London Cockney accent, but with certain cadences still lingering from the west of Ireland, made him seem somewhat unplaceable. He would later assert that he retained nothing Irish whatsoever in his identity, instead becoming a truly and fully internationalist socialist. But I've feel that this lie about his father's death at the hands of perhaps the greatest villains in Irish nationalism, as well as an anecdote that he hated flying on British Airways because he disliked staring at the Union Jacks on the cabin crew's uniforms, does suggest something else about his own identity and the complexities of his connections to Irishness. And then other aspects of his childhood that he would later recall do have more of a ring to truth to them, that he was an altar boy or that he experienced abusive corporal punishment at school. For unclear reasons, and possibly related to a decline in his family's finances, or perhaps even mental health problems on the part of his father, he moved to Britain at the end of the 1920s at about the age of 13 or 14, and at some point then, shortly after that, he became a member of the still relatively new British Communist Party. He became a regular participant in arguments with Trotskyist speakers in Hyde Park in London, as well as some physical assaults on them. And so it's somewhat odd in that context that he abruptly left the Communist Party in 1937 and became a Trotskyist himself. But if you look at this more broadly, there are quite legitimate criticisms that members of the Communist Party have at that time about where communism is going, where Stalinist-style communism is going. And there's slow information coming out of the Soviet Union at that time about things like show trials and purges that would have been quite legitimate reasons to leave the Communist Party and to move towards Trotskyism. According to a story that Healy regularly told, his switch from Stalinist communism to Trotskyism happened after he learned in the midst of his work as a merchant marine radio operator that the USSR was still trading with fascist Italy in the later 1930s. On the other hand, a very leading Scottish Trotskyist called Jock Haston remembered a far less glamorous Trotskyist origin story for Healy, which he recounted in a 1978 interview, saying that Healy's conversion came about after a violent encounter outside a public toilet. As Haston said in this interview, I was selling the Militant, which is a Trotskyist newspaper. I was selling the Militant outside the toilets in Hyde Park, and I got into an argument with Healy and two others who were putting the Stalinist line. And this led to a fracas. So my first contact with Healy was there at a fracas at Hyde Park Corner. Subsequently, he said in discussion with Healy some months later, he came back again and again and argued, and I won Healy over to the Trotskyist movement. Haston had been a sailor who had used his work and travels to distribute socialist literature in Nazi Germany, but was expelled from the Communist Party in 1934 after questioning Soviet trade links with the Third Reich, which I think mirrors just a little too closely the story that Healy told about his own anti-fascism and the motivations for his conversion to Trotskyism. So I think it's quite likely that Healy plagiarized his biography from Haston in that one story. In any case, by the start of World War II, Healy was a well-known figure within the still fairly small world of British Trotskyism. But it is also worth remembering that this was a small world and already prone to splits and divisions. There were 5 separate Trotskyist groups in Britain as of 1939, the Communist League, the Marxist Group, the Revolutionary Socialist Party based in Scotland, the Militant Group, and the Workers' International League. And Healy was in the last of these, the Workers' International League, which had perhaps 40 members in total across the UK. Sometime early in World War II, he returned briefly to Ireland. The Workers' International League suspected that they would be suppressed as part of wartime censorship, and they were investigating the possibilities of printing their publications in Ireland, in what is now the Republic of Ireland, which did not have the same kind of wartime censorship because it was neutral and stayed neutral all through the war, and also because there was no paper rationing in the same way in Ireland as in Britain. Jock Haston went along with Healy, along with a few other select party members. Healy joined the very small Workers' International League branch in Ireland, but then quickly clashed with their leaders. He declared that he would join the Irish Labour Party instead, which then led to his expulsion from the Irish Workers' International League, the Irish branch of the Workers' International League. Under pressure from Jock Haston, the short-lived expulsion was rescinded. The Workers' International League, I think, given its size, could not really afford to lose members. And in any case, this was all probably to Healy's benefit because he would have not found a particularly warm reception in the notoriously right-wing Irish Labour Party. So I'm going to maybe skip a little bit over some of Healy's political activities in the 1940s and 50s just for reasons of time. He remained a leading figure in British Trotskyism and moves through a number of different groups, like the Revolutionary Communist Party, which is a unified Trotskyist party and is the last time there was a single unified Trotskyist party in Britain. He then gets involved as a leader with a relatively clandestine group, usually referred to as the Club or the Group, which was essentially a Trotskyist entryist faction within the British Labour Party. And it's really during the 1950s that Healy developed as a lead, started to emerge as a leader within British Trotskyism. He also starts to develop what would later be one of his most controversial habits, a willingness to reproduce propaganda from the Arab world, provided it could be presented as anti-imperialism. And then at the very end of the 1950s, he forms a group that Steve had mentioned at the start, the Socialist Labour League, or the SLL as it's usually abbreviated to, when he and other Trotskyists begin to be expelled from the Labour Party in the late 50s. And the SLL briefly seemed to be on a kind of an upward trajectory politically when it was able to recruit former members of the Communist Party who had left in 1956 after the Soviet invasion of Hungary and after Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalinism, which was widely circulated in the West. But very few of the people who actually join in the aftermath of leaving the Communist Party actually stay on as members of the SLL. So for instance, Brian Behan, who was a leading member of the British Communist Party and a brother of the Irish playwright Brendan Behan, he had hoped to see the SLL develop into a more democratic form of communism and soon realized that that would not happen with Gerry Healy. Peter Fryer, who was a communist journalist who had written really brilliant eyewitness accounts of the invasion of Hungary as the Daily Worker's Budapest correspondent, began to very quickly tire of Gerry Healy's domineering status in the party. He eventually had to take out actually a restraining order against Healy, or essentially had to get a lawyer to warn Healy. It wasn't a formal restraining order because of how much Healy harassed him within the party as he was leaving the SLL. So the SLL remains active throughout the 1960s, but also I think remains kind of stuck in a rut. It began to develop a reputation for violence against its own members and in a couple of occasions against outsiders. And my sense is that Healy was actually quite happy to have these rumors of his violence circulate. One former WRP member that I interviewed told me in an interview that Healy had a tendency to propagate an aura of just total ruthlessness, but then could benefit from that aura because potential followers believed he was totally ruthless and dedicated to socialism in a kind of a feedback loop. And I think his tendency towards violence was also bound up with the excessive control he had over the SLL. He was the general secretary of the organization, the party treasurer, manager of their print shop, and the official owner of their assets. It was actually when Brian Behan had questioned this that he was expelled from the new organization. Tariq Ali, an Anglo-Pakistani political activist and one of the most prominent representatives of British Trotskyism, in his memoir of the 1960s, remembers the SLL as being, as he said, an ultra-orthodox sect run like a one-party stateless by the supreme leader, Gerry Healy. He found its politics, Tariq Ali found its politics and practices decidedly off-putting. And notwithstanding his later involvement with Trotskyism, Tariq Ali told me in an interview that when he first arrived in Britain in the early 1960s, the SLL actually turned him off from Trotskyism. He said that if the SLL had been the only Trotskyist group active in Britain, he would have, as he said, run a million miles from Trotskyism. I had absolutely no respect for them on any level. In theory, the SLL should have seen a bump in membership numbers in the later 1960s. It starts the 1960s as a very recognized force on the British radical left. So even if the Labour Party had a kind of hegemonic status within the British working class, with the Communist Party remaining small but noticeable in Britain, the SLL is really the only alternative to either social democracy or reformism, if you want to call it that, or communism, Stalinism, if you want to call it that. So if you are basically on the left in British politics and you don't want to join the Labour Party because you see it as too capitulatory and too moderate, you don't want to join the Communist Party because you see it as too doctrinaire, your only real option for another party to join on the left is the SLL. As the 60s progressed, and as we say, anti-Vietnam War protests become stronger and stronger, the SLL doesn't really take part in that. And a sympathetic interpretation of that is that they refused to offer uncritical support to the Stalinism of the Viet Cong. A blunter view, and I think maybe a more accurate view, is that they were skeptical of any popular movement that they couldn't control. And this opposition to anti-war protests, which even on a couple of occasions led to SLL members handing out flyers encouraging people not to join anti-war marches, confused and alienated potential allies on the left. And other Trotskyist organizations, whether that's the International Socialists, who later renamed themselves the Socialist Workers' Party, or the International Marxist Group, in which Tariq Ali was active, tended to be more connected to student movements and anti-war movements, and they start to come to the fore instead in British radical left politics, with the SLL slipping in relative prominence. I'll just pause for a minute to say that from the late 60s until in or around the mid 1980s is really a kind of a golden age for British Trotskyism. There are maybe 20,000 active members of British Trotskyist groups in that period. They outnumber the Communist Party on the radical left. So Trotskyism is quite a serious force in British life at that time, although obviously it is somewhat hampered by the fact that Trotskyists tend to be divided among a number of different groups rather than one single disciplined left-wing party like the Communist Party. There's a different development at the end of the 60s that does start to aid the SLL. Healy starts to attract a small but noticeable number of recruits from the film and entertainment industries. He began to attend a series of debating parties that were being held in flats around London, and where he was making a strong impression on at least some of the people in attendance. So you get people like the film director Ken Loach, a film producer called Roy Battersby, different film producers like Kenneth Trott, Clive Goodwin, film and literary agents, playwrights like Tom Kempinski and David Mercer, and the actor Corin Redgrave. They're all people who are attending these parties. And according to one of his supporters, Healy's very hard-nosed, serious Marxism always sees him win out at these debates, at these parties. The feminist historian Sheila Rowbottom remembers these events very differently, though, recalling Healy's inability to deal with criticism or with new ideas, and particularly ideas drawing on feminism, anti-racism, or psychoanalysis. And I think what's going on here is that people's own personal politics are actually playing an obvious role in how they remember this, or even how they experienced it at the time. So people who are not particularly amenable to Healy's version of Marxism, they tend to come away unimpressed. And those who are receptive to his very clear-eyed politics, or depending on how you want to view it, his very simplistic politics, they're completely captivated by him at these events. By the early 1970s, what I see as all the dominant elements of Gerry Healy's politics are now in place. And I think they're just going to intensify and worsen in the coming years. He has an authoritarian leadership style, a very doctrinaire belief that his group always has the correct Marxist line on any issue, coupled with a certain kind of opportunistic willingness to change his mind at a moment's notice, apocalyptic prophecies about a capitalist collapse that's always just around the corner, an oversized sense of his own importance, the use of violence against his opponents, a desire to recruit celebrities, and if at all possible, hit them up for money, and then uncritical flirtations with third world leaders, who in time can also be you can also get money from them, basically. So with the SLL now again growing in numbers coming into the early 70s, Healy rebranded the party in 1973 as the Workers' Revolutionary Party. His ambitions politically were growing, and the change in name was intended to denote a change in tactics. They're no longer going to be an agitational grouping or a league that's vaguely orbiting the Labour Party. It would now be a true vanguard party in the Leninist model, one that would supposedly lead the British working classes to victory in the looming terminal crisis of capitalism. And I see the WRP in a way as the culmination of Healy's political career, even if it does remain a relatively small force of maybe 3,000 members at most, scattered across all of Britain. In some ways, the WRP is a simple continuation of the SLL, but there was also an important change going on more broadly in British society and British life, and maybe even in international life, that I think does start to make it a different kind of political entity. One of the former members that I interviewed, Andy Blunden, an Australian member of the British Party, who's now a relatively well-known writer on philosophy, he made the point to me in an interview that the WRP was the product of a very specific political context after 1968, when the radical left in various places around the world felt it had come close to victory or to political power, but could now also see and feel that that opportunity was being lost. And I think if you look more broadly at where people go after 1968 and after that moment of revolutionary upsurge, there are some figures on the left, on the new left, as it's usually called, who just start to move completely to the right. So in the United States, for instance, the anti-war historian Eugene Genovese, by the 80s, he is an arch conservative. There are other people who stay kind of loosely left-wing, but they start to burrow into existing institutions, hoping that they can effect some kind of progressive change there. Maybe not as radical as they might have been in the 60s, but hopefully surviving still broadly on the left. So someone even like Bernie Sanders, I think you could describe him in those terms, or the feminist historian and political activist Sheila Rowbottom that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And then there are other new left groups that just completely tear themselves apart and even descend into quite extreme violence, as happens with groups like the Weatherman Underground in the US, the Baader Meinhof gang in Germany, the British Black Power leader Michael X. And Gerry Healy's rigid and very doctrinaire politics, I think, offers a kind of an alternative to all of this, right? In a global context where the left is experiencing loss and failure by the early 70s. The WRP argued that socialists do not have to compromise, and yet they can still affect some kind of real change. The idea that a revolutionary upheaval is always just around the corner, but always also just out of reach, was a perennial theme within the WRP, as well as being, I think, a somewhat coercive means of motivating party members. Many former members that I've interviewed have told me that they were regularly berated for not being dedicated enough to the revolutionary cause, as if it was almost their personal fault that Britain had not yet experienced a revolution. And I also think this atmosphere of very serious and unwavering dedication to revolutionary socialism, that can appear quite doctrinaire to outsiders, is what attracted people like the Redgraves. A lot of former members that I've talked to have spoken about the party's hardness, its toughness, its seriousness. And there's a kind of a macho Trotskyism that I think is at work here. The party is not a very welcoming place for feminism or even just for women in general, which is something I'll talk about a little bit more at the end. And this remains the kind of internal culture of the WRP throughout the 1970s. The party remained well known on the left, even if it remained a somewhat small group. They also began to amass a suspiciously large portfolio of capital assets, ranging from a country house in Derbyshire that they used for Marxist educational retreats, a full-colour printing press in Merseyside in the north of England that they used to print their daily paper, Newsline, which was the first and, to the best of my knowledge, only ever Trotskyist daily newspaper in the world. A fleet of 50 mopeds used to distribute the paper nationally, 8 flats in Clapham in London where party members lived, a party headquarters nearby, a network of bookshops in major cities, a network of youth training centres, a film and theatre company, and a luxury car used by Gerry Healy. At their height, there were 90 full-time employees in the party, which is a quite excessive staff for a party that never really had more than 3,000 members at any one time. How exactly they're paying for all this, I think, fuels a large amount of speculation elsewhere on the radical left in Britain. So there's already rumors swirling around in the late 1970s that are accusing the WRP of being in receipt of money from either the Libyan or the Iraqi governments. When Sean McGamna, a Trotskyist who had once been allied to Healy, made these allegations in print, the WRP tried to sue him for libel. When the BBC ran an expose on the WRP's finances and Middle Eastern connections in 1983, Healy wrote articles in response alleging that this was the work of Zionist operatives within the British media, which really I think starts to cross over into a kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory about the workings of the British media and it's being controlled by shadowy Zionist elements. And I also think some of these stories are actually they're partly the fault of WRP members themselves, including Healy, who are very happy to boost the idea that they have very high-level connections to figures like Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi. And in other ways, these accusations were products of Trotskyism's very polemical culture where charged allegations are just thrown around recklessly. There's a regular allegation that still circulates online about Healy and the WRP that they invited Iraqi trade unionists to a conference in London in 1978 and then duly leaked their names to the Ba'athist government in Iraq, who arrested and executed them as soon as they landed back in Baghdad. And to the best of my knowledge, that does seem to be a fabrication, the accusation itself. There's also an allegation that the WRP sent a photographer to an anti-Saddam protest outside the Iraqi embassy in London to help the Iraqi government identify dissidents. And that does seem to be true. In the course of my work, I was able to identify the photographer who was allegedly involved in this, but he was unsurprisingly not willing to give an interview. So into the 1980s, this is the party that Healy presided over, and he had a very notoriously authoritarian control of the WRP. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, he was expelled from his own party in October 1985, amidst shocking allegations that he had sexually abused at least 26 women within the party and possibly more. The organization split into multiple different factions in the aftermath of this. If people wish, I'm happy to go into more detail about what actually happens there. But I want to end by maybe just talking more broadly about what kind of party this is or what kind of lessons we can take from this history. One of the most common descriptions of the Workers' Revolutionary Party is that it was a cult, with that term becoming a kind of a shorthand for so many of the party's excesses. A lot of former members that I spoke to, they described it to me in those terms, saying that it was a cult. And I think if that's how they remember it, we do have to take that seriously, even if we don't necessarily agree with it. And the cult accusation certainly has some truth to it, right? The ways in which party members are expected to devote all working hours to the organization, the demands that they cut ties with friends and family, the expectations that comrades hand over ever-increasing sums of money to the party, even the way in which the party developed its own internal language that is incomprehensible to outsiders and serves to create a kind of dividing line between members and the outside world. All of that is classically cult-like, maybe even cliched in its cult-like tendencies. But I'm also very hesitant to use the word cult. I think it's too politically easy an assessment for this organization. Dismissing the WRP as a cult means ignoring the connection between their authoritarian culture and their origins in the Leninist movement, right? Their structure as a Leninist party. I've come to see the WRP as a very extreme manifestation of Leninist vanguardism and its anti-democratic praxis. In his 1902 work, What Is to Be Done, Lenin argued for a party that would have very little in the way of internal criticism, would value secretiveness in its work, and would avoid what he called broad democracy. So it would be a democratic centralist party, in which ultimately a central committee makes all major decisions and the membership democratically agree to abide by those decisions. Now, there's lots of ways in which you can argue against this, and you can point out, let's say that Lenin's text, State and Revolution, is actually quite a democratic text. And Lenin probably believed that he could still maintain an internally democratic organization, despite having this quite militarized, like militant type of organization. But the end result of this is still a quite undemocratic politics. And by virtue of its very hardline top-down party structure, the WRP remained not just undemocratic, but also unable to respond to new political developments, things like second wave feminism, environmentalism, or gay liberation. It remained unwilling to even properly incorporate anti-racism into its politics. There are no avenues in the WRP for the rank and file to change party policy. And I think the inability to deal with new issues is of a piece with the long-standing inability to deal with the abuses that Healy carried out against many different members, and particularly sexual abuse against female members. because both are products of a situation where the leadership can't be questioned, and protecting the party's reputation is the paramount concern of the leadership. And in that sense, I think the WRP remains a kind of cautionary tale for the modern left. So as I know I've got a little message there from Steve saying to finish up, as a kind of a concluding thought, I'm going to talk just for a couple of seconds about this book, The Prophet, the third volume of it, particularly The Prophet Outcast by Isaac Deutscher. It's the book that has introduced a lot of people to Trotsky and maybe even to Trotskyism. And there's a particular moment in that third volume where Deutscher is talking about what happens to Leon Trotsky after he gets exiled from the USSR in the late 1920s. And Deutscher talks, kind of surveys what the European left looks like in this specific moment. And he says that there are basically two options on the radical left. There are communist parties that are very rigid, very top-down, unable to deal with criticism from outsiders. And there are social democratic parties that are fluid, that are open to the outside world and are able to deal with criticism. There's certain aspects of what Deutscher's saying there that I'm a bit skeptical of, or a bit, I want to at least like nuance a bit. I don't think communist parties are as rigid as he's making out at the end of the 20s. I think there's still a kind of there are still traces of true democracy within those parties in that period. And I'm also skeptical that social democratic parties are as positive or as open to outside ideas and outside criticism as he's making out. So these are a little bit caricatured. Maybe they need to be nuanced a bit, but they are still true in terms of tendencies that political parties have. And it's how I've come to think about political parties like the WRP, or its really last organized remnant, the Socialist Equality Party in the US, right? These parties tend to be very rigid, very unimaginative, I think quite intellectually shallow. I don't think authoritarianism produces good leaders or good thinkers or good thinking. And I've come to, having completed this book now, I've come to realize that there are many things that a left-wing party needs, but two things that it needs are democracy and discipline. And to give credit where it's due, Trotskyist parties and Leninist parties in general are quite good at maintaining discipline, but their record at internal democracy is patchy at best. And in the cases of groups like the WRP, the SLL, the SEP, their internal democracy is truly terrible. And for me, the question of how you maintain both democracy and discipline, that's one of the most important questions for the left. I don't claim to have an answer to that question, but I do hope that my book could at least be part of trying to answer that question. And I'd be really interested in hearing what people like Peter or Alex that have been directly involved with these groups think about that question or about everything I've just said. I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Aidan. So our next speaker is Alex Steiner. Alex, you're on.
Thank you. Okay, well, that was quite a lot to digest. I'm not going to try to respond to everything in Aidan's presentation, but let me say a few words about what I think is positive about Aidan's book, and then I'll present my criticisms. First, this is the first comprehensive historical investigation of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, and as well as the International Committee of the Fourth International that I am aware of. There have been other historical accounts, mostly by former members such as Alex Mitchell, Claire Cowan, and so on. But they were more in a sense of a personal memoir rather than a comprehensive history. Aidan has tried to present a comprehensive history. He's done a great deal of original research in that area, and he's put together many of these other memoirs as part of that, as well as other documents that he had to go search for in various archives all over the place, which so it's very useful from that point of view. So factually, I think mainly the facts are as I understood them, having been a participant in those events decades ago and having the opportunity to view the workings of the remnants of that movement many years later. So for the most part, it's factually accurate. There are some minor factual problems here and there. I'd be glad to present you with a list of some of those that I noticed at some point. It would have been good if you had asked me about it, give me a preview of the book before you published it. I could have warned you about some of those things. And I think it's particularly useful that the really repressive nature of Healy and his organization be documented. And there have been attempts by some of the inheritors of Healy's legacy to downplay some of those aspects of what you might call Healyism. I never myself used that term, by the way. And it really was very bad. It was a very repressive organization. There was abuse going on, sexual abuse and physical abuse of comrades within that organization. When I was a member, I was not aware of the sexual abuse at all. I was not really aware of the physical abuse, although I heard some stories here and there. But I was certainly aware of what you might call psychological and verbal abuse, because that was going on constantly. And I was present at some of the Central Committee meetings presided over by Healy, where longtime comrades were practically forced to confess their various sins of giving into middle-class idealism and so on. This was some kind of a ritual that was carried out in that organization, and it was to some extent also mirrored in the American group that was sympathetic with them, the Workers' League. Not to that degree, though. I never saw anything quite like what I witnessed at Central Committee meetings of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, and they went on for hours, by the way. Hours and hours. So anyway, we can get into some of those details if people have some questions on that. Anyway, that's what I think was positive about this book. What was negative? Well, what was negative is, first of all, the Workers' Revolutionary Party was not Gerry Healy. It was more than Gerry Healy. Many of us that were attracted to the movement were not attracted because of Gerry Healy, but to some extent despite Gerry Healy. I can tell you that I was first attracted to the movement because of the ideas it expressed. I was first attracted to Marxism and to Trotskyism in particular when I read something about Trotsky's analysis of fascism. And this was in 1969, 1970, when it was fashionable among new leftists to label everything about America as fascist. They even spelled America with a K to indicate this sentiment. And having been around New Left radicalism at that point, which is all I knew about, I sort of tended to go along with that. I didn't know any better. And then somehow by accident, I was sold a copy of the Workers' League newspaper, The Bulletin, and they had an article about the Black Panthers and how their mistaken assessment of fascism can only lead to a politics of despair. And because what does it imply? It implied that the working class has already been defeated, when in fact that was not the case. And by the way, that's not the case today either. So I think there's lessons there for the current situation when we're discussing the Trump regime, or the one that's about to come into being. Anyway, I didn't join the Workers' League after that. I sort of forgot about it, and then I ran into them months later, and then I remembered that. Anyway, it was that was a whole story. And then what further attracted me to the Workers' League and the politics that came along with it was their emphasis on ideas, particularly on philosophy. And I always thought that having a proper philosophical approach was absolutely necessary in order to develop a proper political perspective and a proper political practice. And having myself come from a background as a philosophy student, I was very much taken to that. And that was sort of my entry into the movement. I did finally get to meet Healey later on after I joined the movement. And in fact, I had a number of personal encounters or meetings with Healey. He was certainly, in some degree, a very impressive person. He was uh, a very talented organizer. He knew how to speak to workers. He could speak in their, so to speak, in the language they understood, and he was able to convey revolutionary ideas in a way that they could grasp them. And he had a certain understanding and knowledge of the history of the working class, particularly of the English working class, that he was able to bring to that. So and in that sense, he was a very powerful and he was a very powerful speaker. But one shouldn't make more of that than it was. He was not by any means an original thinker. He was very deficient in the area of philosophy, and what he didn't understand philosophically, he made up for by essentially creating his own philosophical language, which sort of became a substitute for Marxist understanding of philosophical issues. Anyway, that was something many of us grew up with, and there was this ritualized reading of Lenin's Volume 38, which Healey never really understood. Story for another time. Anyway, so let me get to some of the problems in this book. First of all, you don't take the ideas seriously at all. You mentioned some of them, yes. You mentioned some of the political issues that divided the International Committee for Pabelism, but you don't really explore them at all. You make certain assertions about them without any justification, and you leave it at that. And in my opinion, basically appealing to the prejudices of your readers. And the prejudice of your readers are likely to skew in the direction of people who organize a party based on the Leninist model must be authoritarians. And then let me get to the main idea that you are following throughout your book, and that is this lesson that there is something peculiar about democratic centralism that necessarily leads to an authoritarian party structure. I mean, that's essentially the lesson you're taking from this. And you're saying that Trotskyists above all follow this Leninist model, and that is the reason why they fall into this authoritarian structure. And you give the Workers' Revolutionary Party as perhaps the most extreme example of this authoritarian. Now, it is true that the Workers' Revolutionary Party is an extreme example of an authoritarian party structure. No question about it. It was a party in which it was impossible to raise differences within that organization. When factional differences arose, factions had to be work in secrecy. They couldn't openly proclaim themselves as a faction and challenge the leadership and do what you would normally expect to have a period of discussion and conferences and a vote on the different proposals and so on. That simply did not exist in the Workers' Revolutionary Party. And it didn't exist in its offshoots in the Workers' League and later the Socialist Equality Party either, I might add. But there's nothing inherent about democratic centralism that leads to this. This is your mistake. This is I would say it's a Whiggish interpretation of history. Yeah, and what I mean by the Whiggish interpretation of history is you're taking what was a corruption or an outcome that happened, and then you're looking back historically at what that entity was in a previous period, and you're saying what that was in its previous period necessarily led to what it became. Well, that's clearly not clearly that does not follow. I mean, that's a logical misstep you're making there. There are many reasons why parties could degenerate, and this goes for democratic centralist parties as well as other kinds of parties. All kinds of parties degenerate. I would also say that your characterization of the difference between Trotskyist parties and social democratic parties, well, you were a little bit hesitant there, but I've never seen a social democratic party that's actually democratic. I mean, social democratic parties are generally ruled by an elite bunch of leaders, and they have followers that they can sort of do what they want, but they never really have any say in changing the policy of the party. The Syriza party in Greece is a good example. I mean, they held a referendum. 62% of the population said no, and Alex Tsipras says, "Well, fuck you. We're gonna go ahead and capitulate to the demands of the European Union anyway, no matter what you said in the referendum." So that was a social democratic party. I've seen the same thing in the DSA. I once went years ago to a meeting of the DSA. This was around the time, I don't know, it was 7, 8 years ago when, if you remember, when Cynthia Nixon was being approached as running for governor of New York. And there was a discussion at that meeting. This was one of the Brooklyn branches of the DSA, whether the DSA should support her candidacy or not. And we pointed out, well, she never bothered to even call herself a socialist, so why should we support her? And a vote was taken, and 2/3 of the people at the meeting said, no, we should not support her. And I believe there was similar votes throughout the New York area about supporting Cynthia Nixon. And what happened? The leadership of the DSA went ahead and supported Cynthia Nixon. So, so I don't think there's much to say about non-democratic centralist organizations being democratic. Now, if you go back to what it originally means, and Lenin's point was that it's not simply a revolutionary party that needs to be democratic centralist. Any party, if it's a serious political party, needs to be democratic centralist in the sense that you have to have a democratic environment in which members can debate and discuss issues and vote on the policies. But once those policies are agreed upon through a democratic process, then everyone is obligated to fight for them publicly. That makes sense. That's what defines a party as opposed to a bunch of loose individuals. Now you also you give this quote from Trotsky, and this is I guess where the title of your book comes from. You give this quote: "The party in the last analysis is always right because the party is the sole historical instrument given to the proletariat for the solution of its basic problems." Well, I don't really agree with that quote. And I think if you look at it, if you examine it historically, you'll understand where that was coming from. Trotsky said that in the context of the struggles of the left opposition in 1924. And he was under very intense pressure to show that he was a loyal member of the party, and therefore I think he went overboard in that statement. Clearly, you cannot say the party is always right if there are differences within the party, as there were, and even then, there were differences within the party. I mean, saying the party is always right, it actually reminds me of one of the Platonic dialogues, the Euthyphro, where the question there is, Socrates asks, what do we mean by piety? And one of the answers was, piety is that which is love of God. And then Socrates says, well, there are many gods. Which God should you be loving? So this is kind of that kind of a thing. How could you say the party is always right if there are internal differences within the party? So it's an absurd thing to say in the first place, obviously. And you say further that I'll read from your book. The heritage Trotskyist sought to defend was the victorious, if also authoritarian party after the Russian Civil War and after Lenin's death in 1924, rather than the earlier, relatively more democratic party from before 1924, in which factions were allowed to form and some criticism of the party leadership was tolerated. Well, that's exactly wrong. That's not the case. The party after 1924, after it began to degenerate under the leadership of the incoming Stalinist bureaucracy, where for the first time all manner of careerists were introduced into the party, and the party lost its revolutionary bearing. The Trotskyists always looked to the party that existed prior to 1924. So I don't know where that historical assessment came from. So I think your general thesis, therefore, is completely mistaken as far as it applies to Trotskyism, as far as the lessons to be learned from democratic socialism and so on. There are some real lessons to be learned as to the degeneration of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, but I don't think your book got to those. So I'll leave it at that. Obviously, there'll be more to say later.
I think you're muted, Steve.
Thanks. Thank you, Alex. So our next speaker is Peter Ross.
Okay. Thank you, Steve, and everyone here. The first thing I want to say is that I strongly disagree with Mr. Beatty's claim Trotskyism basically is Healyism, or that Healyism comes out of Leninism or Trotskyism. Healyism comes out of the degeneration of the Trotskyist movement and its isolation from the working class following a series of defeats of the working class and the restabilization of capitalism in the post-war period. And what is left of Healyism is the Socialist Equality Party. And that's what I want to focus on here as a former member, because despite its differences with Healy, I think it never fully broke from his methods. I was a provisional member of the SEP. I wasn't a full member, but I worked with them for close to 4 years, from 2017 to 2020, until I was expelled, along with another comrade, Shuvu Bata, over a political disagreement about how we were approaching trade union work. So I want to focus on the SEP, and the first thing that I think has to be said about them is that there is actually a positive side to the SEP. What draws people to them is that they take an uncompromising line against not only capitalism and imperialism, but also against the trade union bureaucracies in the Democratic Party, unlike a lot of supposedly socialist groups, which accommodate themselves to the union bureaucracy or actually try to integrate themselves into it, such as the DSA or the PSL. And the SEP, because of its opposition to the union bureaucracies, is able to provide some useful information on the conditions in the trade unions, and for that reason even gets a readership among some workers, although as I'm going to discuss, they really offer these workers nothing politically. And the sectarian groups like the SEP play another valuable role in that they preserve something of the memory of the historical socialist movement and its principles and traditions, albeit in a highly distorted form. So they're able to attract a number of youth and workers who are becoming radicalized and seeking out answers, but they can also become a dead end. And so, as I've already said, I disagree with Mr. Beatty's political conclusions, but what his book does do is bring valuable material about Healy to light. And I think the SEP doesn't want to deal with this material because it challenges the sanitized version of its own history that it presents to its members. And because it was supposedly during this period when Healy was doing his best work defending the continuity of Trotskyism. So every new member of the SEP reads a document called the Historical and International Foundations of the Socialist Equality Party. And in that document, there's a description of the Workers' League's critique of the WRP and ultimately break with the WRP. And the WRP under Healy was orienting to bourgeois nationalism and petty bourgeois movements around the world, which was really a substitute for doing work in the working class and carrying out a struggle for the political independence of the working class. And what was the WRP's response to that criticism? Quote from this SEP document: "The Workers' Revolutionary Party refused to engage in a discussion of these differences. Instead, it issued threats to sever relations with the Workers' League if it persisted in its criticisms. This unprincipled and opportunist course had ultimately devastating consequences for the WRP." And unfortunately, this is an accurate description of the SEP's own response these days to political criticism. As soon as a member starts to disagree or even just strongly question the party line, they immediately move to isolate the member or expel them if they don't recant. And if they continue to be challenged, they will invariably resort to character assassination as a political method, including against people who have worked alongside them as comrades for years. So after Shuvu was expelled, for instance, they immediately began claiming that he was a quote-unquote agent of the union bureaucracy, when in fact he had no affiliation with any trade union bureaucracy, never has, and was a rank-and-file Amazon Fresh worker at the time. So the SEP will stress intellectual standards and rigorous evidence when it suits them, but this doesn't apply to their own smears against their former comrades, including this attack on Shuvu, for which there was exactly zero evidence. More importantly, there was never any real discussion of the trade union issue that had prompted the expulsion, and this really just served to distract from the political issues. So, and a few months ago, they expelled another member who had carried on an extremely patient, months-long effort to engage his comrades. The response was exactly the same, and one is reminded of Trotsky's description of petty bourgeois sectarians who respond to any challenge with, quote, intrigue, gossip, and hysteria. So this is not a party that is capable of correcting its course, and for that reason, it's not a party that's capable of participating in mass struggles. I also want to note how impoverished the internal life of the party was. We were told that the party was the highest expression of Marxism, but really, every meeting we just heard endless variations of "I agree with everything that has been said" and praising the SEP, and there was never really any serious debate of the political issues. So I think fundamentally one of the main reasons that the SEP is not capable of handling differences in their ranks is the need to maintain the air of infallibility that surrounds the leadership. And debating these issues and the mistakes of the party would undermine this. So, but more fundamentally, it comes from the isolation of the party from the working class, which was part of the critique of the WRP. But rather than correcting for the WRP's abstentionism, the Workers' League was again isolated during the 90s. And in a situation in which the group had not substantially participated in mass struggles in decades, what you were left with was a petty bourgeois formation. And I mean not only in its composition, which is largely lawyers, professors, students, and yes, some workers, but a minority, but primarily I mean its outlook and its political methods. And Trotsky insisted actually that during the split with in the SWP, that more workers need to be brought into the party and that a working class majority could discipline the petty bourgeois minority. But instead in the SEP, we have the domination of the petty bourgeois elements and a pessimism really about the possibility of organizing in the working class that pervades all of their politics. And that's where this abstentionist ultimatistic line toward the trade unions comes from. It comes from a despair about the potential to actually build organization in the working class. And so there's a retreat into a closed off organization. And those are petty bourgeois politics. So if you read about the struggles that the Trotskyist movement carried out in the United States, you'll see a striking difference with the SEP that's just impossible to miss. For instance, Farrell Dobbs, there are some of his lectures online available. He talks about the Trotskyists in the 30s and 40s systematically built up rank and file organizations in the unions. They recruited unorganized workers, they organized pickets, they established a flying squadron system, and they challenged the conservative AFL leadership from within the unions. And the SEP points today to their campaign for Will Lehman for president of the UAW as the biggest intervention the Trotskyist movement has ever had in the UAW, which is completely false. The Trotskyists carried out a struggle in the UAW in the 30s and 40s, and they had a significant impact despite their small numbers. And they actually managed to recruit over 100 cadre from the UAW. And they led the efforts to oppose the no strike clause during World War II, and they raised the demand for a labor party to break workers from subordination to the Democrats. And the contrast is just striking between this patient effort to build up rank and file organization in the UAW versus the SEP's approach, which was to use a presidential campaign as a purely propaganda tool to recruit to the SEP, basically, without any attempt to build up rank and file organizations within the UAW. So for the SEP, intervening in worker struggles is secondary to recruiting to their group. So I would encourage anyone to listen to those lectures by Federal Dobbs on the Trotskyist work in the Teamsters, because they capture the spirit and the methods of revolutionaries who carried out a fight in the trade unions and were able to accomplish great things in spite of their small numbers. And I particularly encourage SEP members to listen to it and see if they can possibly reconcile the methods of historical Trotskyism with those of the SEP. I think they're totally at odds. So the policy of Trotskyism was you have to go into the working class and fight in the unions. You participate in the struggles of the working class, and you train people in those struggles. The SEP's position is you build your own little group. And so as a member, you don't really learn anything about the actual conditions in the unions from actual experience carrying out a fight in the unions. You're forced to completely rely on abstractions and speculations. Now, finally, I want to illustrate the inadequacy of the SEP's political methods through my own experiences with how the SEP approaches political activity. So during the time I was around the SEP, I was a member of UAW 4811, which is the union of academic employees, like teaching assistants and so on, at the University of California. So rather than using their members at the university to conduct systematic political work inside the UAW, I was basically asked to help build a club that had nothing at all to do with the unions and didn't engage them in any way. And since breaking with the SEP, I've actually played a role in building a rank and file caucus in opposition to the union leadership. And this really came about because of the 2022 strike, after many members became alienated by the local leadership's top-down methods. The leadership in my local is dominated by people that come from the DSA, also in block with members of the PSL. And what those both groups agree on is basically completely controlling the union, continuing the business unionist practices, dismissing and shutting down dissent, character assassination against troublemakers. So this was displayed to such a degree during the 2022 strike that it really radicalized a lot of members, and we were able to bring together these members into a new formation in opposition to the leadership. And the SEP will say, well, this group is appealing to the leadership or to the bureaucracy, but really that's not the case. The group came together around the project of democratizing the local, of bringing the membership into the process of making decisions, of getting rid of the current leadership, and also not just the leadership, but also ending the practices that allow them to exercise control of the union's operations, such as bargaining behind closed doors, which actually they've just done again right now, trying to get through a tentative agreement extending our contract and separating us from the other major unions that are currently negotiating. So we've managed to build up a significant group actually, and particularly over the last year. And ultimately, this led to the political strike that we led in the spring against the police repression of the student protest and our members, and solidarizing ourselves with the demand that the university stop investing its assets in more profiteers. And we have a wide enough sphere of influence now that we're actually able to challenge the leadership and basically building an instrument of dual power within the local. So that, in my view, is how you actually build a rank and file committee. You don't try to start outside of the union where you're isolated from the workers. So another anecdote. I actually wrote the founding statement of the so-called Educators Rank and File Committee of Los Angeles back in 2019, I believe. And this was supposedly a committee of public education teachers for the whole Los Angeles area. In reality, there were two teachers in the group who were not really involved in the political direction of the group. And I was just a teaching assistant at the time. I wasn't even a full-time public teacher. So I said at the time, this doesn't seem right that I'm writing this statement on behalf of this committee that claims to speak for the educators of the Los Angeles area. And I was told, basically, we have to build the organization and then workers will come to it. So I think that that's a really crazy method. We would go to a strike, ASME strikes, for instance, and basically just dive bomb into the pickets with flyers. And the workers would look at us like aliens. who were these guys? We never built any kind of organization in ASME, or any of the unions, and we never helped them with their pickets. We never took any steps to build a cell that could actually make inroads. And so when we came with the political perspective, we had no standing with the workers, and we were just ignored, and rightly so. Finally, during the Black Lives Matter protest, there was actually a party policy that the membership should not go to the protests, and basically that we should confine ourselves to an online propaganda presence in order to avoid COVID infection and the police repression. And it was claimed that that was necessary in order to keep the cadres safe for future struggles. And as I recall, I believe that was just announced during a meeting by David North without any kind of discussion or debate. And I remember that a number of younger members disagreed with that policy. It just seemed really crazy that we were sitting out this mass struggle. I mean, I still think it was just a laughable policy. But again, this wasn't even really discussed. So last thing I'll say is the SEP is really sounding the alarm over the last few years about the political crisis in the US, which I agree is very serious. And I think that there is an ongoing effort by a section of the capitalists to overthrow the Constitution and set up a dictatorship in this country. So if the SEP really were serious about fighting against this, I think it would be organizing in the working class in a serious way. I think a couple of hundred cadre could have a big influence in the labor movement. They could have a real impact, actually. So, but instead, they confine themselves to writing articles. And so combating sectarianism and abstentionism is an urgent question, I think, actually. So there are going to be mass struggles in this country against mass deportations, against attacks on democratic rights, against war and genocide, and masses of people are going to be radicalized. So the conditions for developing a rebirth of the socialist movement are coming, and that will also mean the rebirth of the Trotskyist movement. And so it's important that we reclaim that heritage, and that to me is the significance of the fight against sectarianism and the distortion of history by groups like the SEP. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And our last speaker is Gerry Healy. Welcome, Gerry.
Okay, I'm really sorry because I missed most of the meeting because I mistook the timing of the meeting. But I do have a few brief things to say. I do agree with what Peter Ross has to say, and I agree with the thesis that in fact the most important way to engage with the workers' movement is by the Workers' United Front. That is, that you must engage by listening to what other people have to say and what other groups have to say, and by engaging with them as they put forward their thesis. Starting out from the position that you yourself have got all the answers and the rest of the people that are engaging in this struggle are pseudo-lefts, are in fact not serious revolutionaries, are not attempting to engage in the revolution, is, I think, completely wrong and self-defeating. That was the primary aspect of the Gerry Healy's backwardness. In my view, he would not engage with any of the other leftist groups. When we had the right to work marches that were so successful, and the SWP of the IS, as it was, attempted to engage with them, he absolutely would not engage with them on any level or any kind of a united front engagement. At the moment, in my view, the WSWS, the SEP people have taken this so-called principle to a further extreme. Everybody else is not really a leftist at all. They're only pseudo-leftists. They're only pretending to be left. It's not just simply that they're wrong. They're totally bogus characters. And in this aspect, the primary question was, in my view, the women's movement. The women's movement that emerged again after the Russian Revolution in the 60s and 70s, was dismissed by Healy as a bogus thing to avoid the class struggle, he said. And then, of course, the question of the serious sexual regime that he presided over against all the women's comrades, well, you only have to look at the details of what he did and how he got away with it. And in fact, the attitude of people like David North to that, this wasn't a serious question. This was only a diversion from the main thing, which was the socialist revolution, and the women had nothing to do with it. In fact, if that was simply the case, that the women had to wait until after the revolution to get some measure of equality, then you would have to say that Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime are on the right tracks. Wait till we take power, and then all that, and the great leader then has the opportunity to do exactly what he wants to do, and the same is true for all the other issues, as if the women's equality and the equality of oppressed peoples and the equality of all that weren't crucial aspects, crucial of the revolution itself. What was the point of the revolution if it wasn't to overthrow all inequality? Then you would have to ask: was Nietzsche right then? Was Nietzsche right about his theories about what was equality, and was it that human beings simply had to wait for the revolution or after the revolution to seek equality? No, that is not the case. Every serious revolution in all of human history was about human equality when it came to the masses, from the Spartacists, I am Spartacus, from them to, of course, the English Revolution with the diggers and levelers, to the French Revolution with the question of in the French, the conspiracy of equality, and of course the Russian Revolution itself. Was Stalin right then about his notions about socialism in a single country as against the Bolsheviks from universal human equality? I say no. This is a fundamental revision or of rejection of human equality. Unless all these aspects are fundamentally part of the socialist revolution, then we can't have the revolution at all, and we won't be able to fundamentally appeal to the masses of humanity to make that revolution. Look at Trump now and the stuff he is saying. What is our answer to Trump? Is he a fascist in the making? He is a fascist, and he's coming in there, and he will be the US fascist unless we have this universal understanding about what human equality is. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerry.
Chance to speak, since we've been continuously attacked, Comrade Seltzer. Will we have a chance to speak?
You will have a chance to speak.
I think we should.
You will have a chance to speak. So I want to, before we open it up to discussion, I want to talk about a struggle that I was involved in earlier, and that was the fight for the Labor Party. And Aidan's book does mention one sentence about my expulsion from the Workers' League around the issue of the Labor Party. But, we face today, and this is the whole question of the political vacuum in the United States and internationally, that there is no mass working class party. And the reason I joined the Trotskyist movement at that time, the Workers' League, because they were for a labor party. And they wanted to build an international working class movement. So the struggle over the Labor Party then in 1984, and actually today, is a critical struggle. How is the working class going to confront these attacks on it without a political party of the working class, a mass democratic party of a working class? And I and 30 others in the Workers' League at that time took up a struggle for a labor party. And there was a conference actually of 300 trade unions in St. Louis in 1972 for a labor party. It was the largest demonstration held for a labor party until that time, led by the Workers' League at that time. Following that conference of workers from throughout the country, there were expulsions that took place. Tom Cagle, who was a longtime auto worker who was in the SWP, left it because of where the SWP was going. And the question that we formed the Labor Party around was not just that we had to build a mass workers' party, but we had to have democracy, a democratic movement and a democratic party in the Workers' League to have a discussion and debate. The idea of a Labor Party means you're going to have political differences. You're going to have eclecticism. You're going to have all different kinds of points of view about the working class. So there needed to be a discussion in our organization, and we were attacked. 30 people were expelled at that time in 1984. Now, the question is, where is that in the history of the SEP? In fact, not only is that not in the history, that expulsion and that struggle over the Labor Party, but also the SEP has refused. And I asked David, who's on this call, at a meeting that he had in Berkeley, at UC Berkeley, when were they going to put up the entire archives of the Workers' League? The pamphlets, the bulletins, why wasn't that available to the membership of the Workers' League? Any other revolutionary organization, even the Spartacists, have their back issues, all the back issues of their paper, of their press. This is a prerequisite of a revolutionary party. You have to have your history available to the members. That, he said at that time, David, that you were working on it. You were working on getting your party's history up on your website. Well, apparently you're still working on it because it's not there. You have to go to the Marxist archives to get copies of the bulletin. Now, I find that a fundamental break, frankly, with Marxism. How can people call themselves Marxist and not have their own history available to their members? This is a problem. I want to say also, with the rise of fascism and the lessons of Trotsky for the United Front in Germany, today we need a united front of the working class. The threat of a smashing of the unions, of racist attacks on blacks, Asians, mass deportations require that we build a united front in the working class. And that is nowhere in the calls of the Socialist Equality Party, WSWS. Nowhere are they calling for a united front of the working class. They call for people to join them, and they are not calling for a labor party because they believe, as I think sectarians believe, is that people will join them directly. There is no need for a mass labor party. And this was a struggle that Trotsky had against Cannon, because Cannon had been opposed to the fight for a labor party. He was of the view that people would go directly into his organization at that time. Not true. And I think today we need to unite with the left, other organizations who see the need for a mass workers' party, to have a democratic mass workers' party where we can actually develop a real political alternative and build a working class party and a working class movement. And that, I think, is our a critical task today. And that's one of the reasons we're having this discussion today. What are the tasks today that we have to do in organizing the working class? And as last, there are going to be fascist attacks on the unions. The UAW may be put in trusteeship, and maybe I think they will be put in trusteeship, and Sean Fain will be put in prison, or they'll try to arrest him for corruption. We need to take this seriously, and we need to make sure that workers are prepared politically for what's coming. So with that, put your hands up, and the first speaker is David North.
Thank you. First of all, I would make the point that there's time and place. Am I unmuted? Right.
Yes. No,
there's a time and place for discussion of political issues, which we're more than willing to conduct. But this is a discussion. The prerequisite for any discussion of political issues is historical truth and historical accuracy. And the subject of today's meeting, as I understood it, is the book that has been put out by Aidan Beatty, which is, to be blunt, a scurrilous, slanderous attack on Gerry Healy, on the history of the Trotskyist movement in Britain and internationally. I first must state as a preface to making certain points about Beatty's book is that he contacted me in early 1973 and said he wanted to talk to me about the Workers' Revolutionary Party. I did speak to him, and the first question I raised with him is, what did he know about the history of the Trotskyist movement? What had he read? And he acknowledged that he had read virtually nothing. The initial discussion, and by the way, the chats which followed are all documented, and I've published them. He did not have any familiarity with the history of the Trotskyist movement. And then he sent me finally, he was very anxious to interview me. He finally sent me a message asking for a contact for a woman comrade. It was by that point very clear that what he was doing was not writing a history of any serious character, but he wanted to write basically a scandal document of an anti-communist character on the Workers' Revolutionary Party. I asked him, by the way, as well, had he read any of my extensive and exhaustive criticisms of the WRP and of the politics and theories advanced by Gerry Healy between 1982 and 1985. He had read none of it. He was not familiar with it, though the critique that I've written probably numbers in the hundreds and hundreds of pages. He was totally unfamiliar and, in fact, uninterested in any of the political, theoretical, historical issues that arose in the conflict in the Workers' Revolutionary Party. And in fact, the central issue which is raised by his book is he presents his book as the work of a historian. But none of the basic qualifications and responsibilities that a historian has in writing history is followed by Beatty. Virtually everything he says is unsourced, unsubstantiated, based entirely on allegations made by political enemies of Gerry Healy. And of course, Gerry Healy had many political enemies, which he accumulated in the course of a long career, among the Stalinists, among the anarchists, among, of course, the Pabloites. This is well known. But I want to just focus on a few points of Beatty's book, and I think he has a responsibility to answer it. He begins his book by claiming, and he presents it as the foundational lie of...
Okay, David,
let me just finish what I'm saying.
We're going to limit the comments to 3 minutes a person.
I will not speak that long because we've really published much of this on the workers in the World Socialist website. But he starts by saying that Healy lied when he claimed that he saw his father killed by the Black and Tans. In fact, Healy never made such a claim. There is not a single account based on documents, based on anything Healy wrote, in which he made such a statement. These are all post-1985 hearsays. We will be publishing very shortly a interview with Irish comrades who knew Gerry Healy in the 1960s, who testified that Healy never made such a claim. I have spoken to Healy's daughter. She who is not referenced, by the way, by Aidan Beatty. He never made such a claim. He also claimed this is an entire lie, and it's very important.
Okay, can you kind of wrap it
just
up?
a few, you let other people speak for a group.
Well, yeah, there are other people who are on the panel.
Well, but I think I'm speaking as somebody who has firsthand knowledge of Gerry Healy.
There are other people that have firsthand knowledge.
And you should let me finish what I'm saying. I'll be finished within 5 minutes.
Well,
the other point he says,
you've already had more than...
Obviously, you don't want me to speak and expose this. You gave an enormous amount of time to people to attack the Socialist Equality Party. You'll let me finish making these points about Aidan Beatty's.
Well, okay.
He also claims, and which is entirely untrue, that Healy manufactured his history. He did nothing of the sort. He claims that Healy came from an area of Ireland which was relatively quiet. In fact, Healy was born in one of the most violent areas of the Civil War and Revolution.
That's 100% inaccurate. You have no idea what you're talking about. You are an uninformed clown.
No.
Okay,
and
look.
you don't. And by the way, in one point, in which you
call
did
this
not
too hard.
explain in your own
This is getting us nowhere. This is getting us
you
nowhere.
wrote this
Okay,
book as a member of the DSA,
David, we're
and you are
prepared. We're
financed
prepared.
by the
David,
Zionists.
David,
I'm not a
we're-
Zionist, you
Okay, wait a
clown.
minute. David,
You
we're
were for the
prepared.
last 10 years of your academic career. You
David-
have been extensive.
Okay, David, we're prepared to have a discussion about the history with you giving equal time, but that's not what this is. This is an analysis of the book and with panelists and an open discussion. And
you're muting me the moment I raise issues relating to his background. Why does it?
Okay, look, this you had time, and I think that
you did not give him time.
People want to find out what your positions are. They're quite open to go to the
you're not letting me
website.
Speak.
Okay, so
limited amount of time to
okay. So
but you don't. Mr. Beatty is a subject. Why was he financed?
Okay, look, David.
What was your application
David, do I have to remove
and other institutes to get money?
David, do I have to
give you
a meeting to?
Because I'm an academic.
Yeah.
No, you're not. You're not working as. What was the basis?
David, do I have to remove you from the meeting?
Which led.
David, do I have to remove you from the meeting? Steve had his hand up. Steve, why don't you go? And then Tom Mackerman. Steve?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve. Yes, good to see you again. Can you hear me?
Yes,
do I need to make
we can hear you.
Thank you. Yeah. I think some fundamental questions are being raised here that need to be dealt with in a very measured way, rather than I joined the WRP, the Socialist Labour League, as soon as I heard about it when I went to university. That was in 1964, and eventually threw me out because I said it wasn't doing what it was supposed to be doing in the fragment of the WRP that I finished up joining, because it wasn't actually making a scientific critique of the role of labour. In other words, the role of labour is to do consciously what nature does unconsciously, sustaining intelligent life on Earth for as long as humanly possible. And because the WRP at that SLL had the best critique of it had the best critique of why that didn't happen in the Soviet Union, that I joined the WRP and stuck with it until they threw me out, because the fragment that I joined did not develop a critique of what was going on in China, following the failure of the collectivization of the land in the top-down collectivization of land in the Soviet Union, and the failure of the Cultural Revolution in China. We are the most conscious species that inhabits this planet, and if we don't figure out how we're going to coexist with all the others, we're fucked. And it seems to me that Marx and Engels made that very clear. Engels in was particularly lucid in the dialectic of nature, and his scientific socialism and utopian. And I don't see. And I'm now a member of the Labour Party, because I moved from Bradford, where I was active for most of my political life, to somewhere in North London, where they didn't know me. And so that I was able to join the Labour Party. As soon as I joined the bloody Labour Party, they made me secretary of the bloody branch, because nobody was interested. They didn't know what they were. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But I do have some sympathy with the attack that's being made on David North. I've known him since whenever, and I do worry, as Gerry pointed out. Gerry Downing, whom I meet frequently, and have very fierce arguments, I have to say. They're very, very fierce arguments with him about stuff. The fundamental question of the nature, what is it that distinguishes from all other species, as far as going right back to Kant, Immanuel Kant, and then but Engels made it far clear: if we get this wrong, we're fucked. And that's where we are at the moment. We're getting it wrong, because in this country here, where there's no organisation that's putting that forward in the way that I want to join. So I'm stuck with the Labour Party. And by the way, just going back to the author of the book, I've forgotten Aidan. He missed out completely, paid no reference to the domination, the power that the Communist Party exercised in this country. it was extremely hard to get our voices heard against the corruption that was going on in the Soviet Union. It was self-evident what was going on in the Soviet Union, but so many of the Communist Party, and they were very, very good at training workers to get up and speak on their own behalf and work through the trade union movement. They had excellent. They trained people to be really good orators in the way that we never managed it. We had one or two, and Gerry Healy, to be fair to him, he had a major role in developing those working class militants who were prepared to stand up against the Stalinists in this country. So I thought the introduction to this debate from, I think somebody else has called him an academic. He's not an activist. I don't think he's put his show. I don't see. Sorry, from what he said so far, I haven't put his shoulder to the wheel of actually sort of enlightening the working class into what its historical role is to take charge of its own affairs. Thank you, Steve. I think that I might want to come in later.
Thank you.
I think there's so many other questions that have not been even begun to be addressed tonight. Thanks for that.
This is. I want to let everyone know this is the first discussion panel that's been held on this issue. So I believe more discussion, more debate, and everyone to have their say on these issues. I think that's important. Tom Mackaman, and then Peter Ross, and then Aidan, you want to make comments on the contribution so far. So Tom, and then Peter.
Yeah. David North, in his review of this book on the World Socialist website that I encourage those of you to who haven't done so to read, characterizes the book as hack work, and I think it's an apt characterization. Mr. Beatty presents himself as an Irish historian, and that's the hook on which he hangs the subject, because Healy was born in Ireland. One of the most astonishing things about this book is that there's virtually nothing about Irish history, and what there is a false presentation. As far as the black and tan story, I looked into this. I wrote on this as well. There is no written source that can be found. It appears that Sean McDomna may be the earliest progenitor of this. McDomna is a notorious liar. He's a Zionist who, among other things, called for the retention of British forces in Northern Ireland and American forces in Iraq. This is the sort of people who were interviewed for this book. One of the knowledgeable sources on Gerry Healy. The first pages of the book contain not a single archival reference to Irish history, and the one secondary scholarly work that is used is misused. And this is just the first few pages. As for Mr. Beatty's funding history, he can, I think that those in this meeting, I'll put in the chat box an article that recently appeared on the World Socialist website. It's quite a history of being funded by Zionist and pro-Zionist sources, including such very outspoken Zionist sources as the Azrieli Institute in Montreal. I've looked at some of Mr. Beatty's books, and they are classically Zionist. They write out of history of the Palestinians. In his major book on Irish masculinity, which is actually a comparative study between Irish nationalism, a very false equation between Irish nationalism and Zionism, the one being an anti-colonial struggle, the other, the quintessential colonizer's ideology. There are 3 entries for Palestinians in the whole book. One could go on. And I think he should answer for these questions. He has not done so. But this book is a hit piece on Gerry Healy. His sources, his so-called oral history project, which he intends evidently to keep under wraps, was conducted with enemies of Healy's that he culled together as his major archival source, so-called. So we're not quite done with this. As David noted, there will be another article that will actually get into Irish history. It's a very fascinating and explosive period in Irish history, including in the west of Ireland. Mr. Beatty, his characterization of it is completely and utterly false.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Aidan, and then Alex, and then Tom McAvan.
So the reason I don't respond to these comments is because they're stupid, and I'm not going to waste my time. I'm going to go back to an actual serious thing that was said, which is what Peter started by saying. That what attracted him to the SEP was its uncompromisingness. And then Peter goes on to say, like, there are problems with the SEP, right? There are these good things about them as an organization. I think there are good things about the WSWS, right? The scale at which it can produce documentation, can produce articles is impressive, but there are downsides to that then in terms of that becomes an end in itself. And this was a problem that the WRP had, right? It's incredibly impressive that the WRP had a daily paper. For a very small organization to be able to pull that off is quite impressive. But it became an end in itself. It sucked up so much time on behalf of the party that became the party's main activity, was just selling papers. And that's a dead end. There's a thing that Peter said then, that as a critique of the SEP, that it becomes a party incapable of adapting. It engages in a kind of abstentionism, like it doesn't get involved in working class organization. Steve said, I'm not involved in activism. That's not quite true, but we'll leave that for now. What I want to say about what Peter's saying is, like, first of all, I think he's completely correct, right? I mean, obviously he's correct in terms of knowing what attracted him, but being uncompromising is the flip side of being incapable of adapting. And I think that's it's a very hard thing to square. Like, how do you be genuinely militant and radical, but also just live in the world and actually have a party that can build connections to the working class? As Steve points out, right, I mentioned briefly this thing about the SEP and the building of the Labour Party. The reason I don't really talk about it in the book is because the book is not about the SEP. I just had this kind of minor thing at the end about them. A Labour Party would have to be, as Steve pointed out, I think he's correct, right? It would have to engage in first of the conversation of what kind of party is this going to be? If it's just going to be a Trotskyist party, where people have to toe apart a very specific Trotskyist line or kind of a specific subset of Trotskyists, it's doomed to failure. If it's a party that can be fluid and open and have different strands, then it might be something. And I think that's a conversation to have about how do we reconcile these things? How do we be radical and uncompromising, but not doctrinaire and kind of close in on ourselves and be cut off from the world? I think that's a really interesting conversation to have. I'm not really interested in having a conversation with people about Irish history who haven't actually done the reading on Irish history. I'm not interested in having a conversation with people who are accusing me of being a Zionist. David North said he wants to start by being factual, and then he proceeded to say a whole load of things that are just not factual. That's not a productive conversation. That's not a conversation I'm going to have any time with. To be totally honest, in my own work, I've moved on. I'm doing other things now. I'm not going to spend a lot more of my time thinking about Gerry Healy. He was not a particularly nice person, and I'd rather spend my time doing other things. That's what I'm moving on to. I would love to have productive conversations that are at least coming off the back of the book. You know, Alex and Peter, Jerry Downing, I interviewed all of them. I was happy to talk to anyone that was willing to talk to me. I'm sure if I sat down with Jerry, Alex, or Peter and went through like issue by issue, what do we believe in on every issue? We probably don't agree with everything. I would imagine the same is probably true of Steve. But we could have, I suspect, I mean, I certainly think this of Jerry, Alex, and Peter, having had some interactions with them, we probably could have some productive conversations. We probably could be involved in political organizations together. I saw someone recently online, and this is the final thing I'm going to say, saying that if you want to join an organization in this new moment after Trump being elected, you should join an organization where everyone is in broad agreement about the goals, but disagrees about the methods. I think that's a really good organization to join. The SEP is not that organization. I'm going to end there.
Okay, thanks. Alex?
First, I wanted to get back to a couple of the things. I do want to congratulate Aidan for doing the research he did. I think writing this book can only help clarify issues of the building of a movement that fights for socialism, despite my philosophical and political differences. I do think on the factual material, he is mostly right. I don't claim to be any expert on Irish history or any of that stuff, but I can tell you that it was well known that Gerry Healy fabricated a lot of tales about his personal life. One of the people who believed that was Aileen Jennings, who was his for many years his private secretary and aide, and she knew Gerry a lot better than anybody else here.
Can I say
better.
one thing about that, Alex?
Yeah.
Whoever it was said there's no source for this claim. The source is Karina Lotz's biography of Gerry Healy. She was his secretary after his expulsion from the WRP. And there are multiple people I spoke to. It is not unverified. It is a verifiable claim. It is a verifiable fact that he made those claims. It's just false to say otherwise.
Okay.
And I think
Well,
you should show
thank
it.
you for that. Let me finish. So that being said, I do think if there's time, Mr. North should be given 2-3 minutes to finish up what he was trying to say. But I do want to say though that when Mr. North says Aidan Beatty's book is scurrilous, I think the World Socialist website is scurrilous. I think they have been engaged in slanders and character assassination against their political opponents. I was being accused of being an FBI informer. David North told some lies about the historical conjuncture of Wilforth's removal as Secretary of the Workers' League. I was involved in that, so I know what I'm talking about there. The charges against Mr. Beatty as being a Zionist, I don't know what he wrote before that. There's nothing pro-Zionist in this book that I could see, so that's all I can say about that. I mean, this is a way of avoiding a genuine discussion, and I think people like Tom, who consider themselves historians, should be ashamed of themselves for contributing to this kind of slanders. Well, that's all I have to say at this point. Thank you.
Okay, David, you have 5 minutes.
We'll make the point again. There is nothing in Aidan Beatty's book which is of a historical character. Historians base themselves on documents. They base themselves on verifiable statements, not third and fourth and fifth ad infinitum hearsay. There's nothing but hearsay in this book. I'm the only one who's speaking who actually engaged in a political struggle against Gerry Healy and produced an exhaustive critique. But what distinguished my opposition to Healy was that it was not of a personal character. I had the greatest respect, and I still do have great respect for Gerry Healy's role in the history of the Trotskyist movement, which Mr. Beatty never addresses at all. You can't speak about Gerry Healy without, of course, discussing the historical conditions under which the Trotskyist movement fought. Gerry Healy joined the Trotskyist movement in the 1930s when it was a period where mass murder was being carried out, what has been described as the genocide of Trotskyists. He built a movement under conditions in which in Britain, the Stalinists dominated the labor movement alongside the laborites. And Gerry Healy built a movement in opposition to this, first in the closest alliance with the Socialist Workers' Party. He was a co-author and co-signatory of the document which founded the International Committee of the Fourth International. He played a monumental role, and all of those who knew Gerry and worked with him, and that includes, by the way, Alex Steiner, at one point were enormously impressed by his contribution. I think that probably includes you as well, Steve. The subsequent degeneration of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, which, by the way, was documented at length in a document which I co-authored with Kirti Balasuria, never referenced by Aidan Beatty, explained in detail the political issues which led to the degeneration of the WRP, and Healey and Banda and Slaughter's responsibility for that. And we also explained, and as a matter of fact, the issue of violence, sexual allegations, all of this was developed and utilized in the autumn of 1985 by Banda and Slaughter in order to shut down any discussion of the political circumstances which had led to the degeneration of the WRP. Now, as again for Aidan Beatty's book, whether he likes it or not, he presents himself as a historian. And whatever his opinions may be, or other people's opinions may be of the political line of the WRP, that's one matter. There are many people who write biographies of people with whom they don't agree politically, with whom they have differences, but there are certain rules of scholarship. And historians work with documents. He doesn't work with documents. He went into this project. He says he doesn't even remember when he first heard of Gerry Healy. Well, he's not telling the truth. He was active at the DSA at Wayne State University in Detroit. He's very familiar with our political work at Wayne State University. The DSA, of which he's a member, called Police Against Us. He's aware of all of this.
No,
he's not a politically ignorant man. And when he says, by the way, when he says in his acknowledgments that organizations which are in fact pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist organizations were generous enough to see the global and international implications of Healy's activities in the Middle East, well, he should tell us, I'd like to see the document he wrote requesting funding. He is a man who does have a very long and documented history, which can be easily verified, of being funded by Israeli organizations. He also argues, and it's central to his whole conception of Irish nationalism, that Zionism and Irish nationalism are essentially equivalent movements. When anyone who's familiar with the subject knows that the Irish movement, the Irish Republic movement, is one of the great democratic national movements of the late 19th and early 20th century. Zionism is a colonialist movement. To compare the two is a fraud. And we're making the accusation here that this is in fact a factional diatribe which was produced using history as a cover to essentially launch a scurrilous attack on Gerry Healy. And even those who oppose the Socialist Equality Party, and everybody has a right to belong to whatever political organization they want, and they're free to criticize the SEP as much as they want, and we can answer them. However, when you write, and you know, Steve, you came to one of my meetings and I welcomed you. No one had any objection to you coming and speaking out against our politics.
And we welcome you and others from the SEP.
However, what Mr. Beatty is doing is something entirely different.
Okay.
He's written, I'll finish 30 seconds and I'll finish. He's written a scurrilous, slanderous, lying account, and he's done this in the service of the DSA, the Democratic Party, and those who are financing him. He who pays the piper calls the tune, and that's what's involved here. And Mr. Beatty, you can laugh all you want.
Okay,
you have an obligation to explain
why
your time. Okay,
yes, you do. And you may drop this, but we won't.
Okay,
go ahead.
Thank you.
We won't. We have a lot more coming out.
Jerry Downing.
This latest contribution by David North, yet again, he makes the claim that the issues that brought down Gerry Healy were unsubstantial issues. These weren't the real politics that we're really interested in. The sexual abuse of women over the decades that he participated in, the cover-up of these abuses. Well, that's not really politics, is it? That's nothing to do with politics. We're just good revolutionary people, and women's oppression. Well, that's just a secondary issue that serious political people just couldn't be bothered with. Why should we bother with such a thing? For Aidan Beatty's book, I don't agree with it all, but I do have to say that many of the points that are made are really quite substantial against David North. and against the stuff that he does come out with. His WSWS site does produce some good substantial articles on many things that I follow quite closely. But the last thing I want to say is that I try to put forward the very well-known fact that the leader of the second revolution, Abraham Lincoln, was a racist, and that he came out with openly racist things. He said, for instance, that black people should never be made equal to white people. They shouldn't be allowed on juries. They shouldn't be allowed to vote. They shouldn't be allowed to marry white people, etc. And of course, you can't say that to David North, because he is a true American patriot who thinks that Abraham Lincoln was the real revolutionary, and of course they
greatest figures in world history.
Okay, can you?
All right, thank you.
Wrap it up. Okay, thank you. Okay, Tom, and I think that'll be our last contribution, and then the panelists will have a chance to wrap it up. So Tom, and for 3 minutes.
And since I think it was Alex Steiner said that I should be ashamed for looking at the veracity of Beatty's historical claims. It's a very, very odd thing for someone calling himself a socialist to assert. I would just say, read the articles that we've published. They're rich. They're historically rich. They take a very close look at Beatty's work. And he, in fact, in the book, he does reveal bits and pieces of his own politics. For example, on page 15, 16 of the book, he attacks one of Healey's pamphlets. It's actually a really powerful pamphlet defending Egypt in the Suez Crisis. Egypt was under attack by France, Britain, and Israel. You can look this up on Marxist.org. It's a very strong defense of Egypt, and Beatty calls it hearted up anti-imperialism. So I mean, this is sort of typical of the method. I'll just add one more, and since I heard, I believe it was Steiner say that it was such a great research book, there are five footnotes to published writings by Gerry Healy. 5. That's an embarrassment for an academic historian. It's not a serious work of scholarship. It is a hit piece, and we will have more to say about it.
Okay, thank you. So we'll wrap up with the panelists. Alex, you want to wrap it up?
Just wanted to clarify that last point. When I said you should be ashamed of yourself, what I meant was you should be ashamed of yourself for being silent when people's characters are being destroyed, when people are being accused of being FBI informers, and you say nothing. If you consider yourself a historian, you're a pretty terrible historian.
Okay, Peter, did you want to have any comments on it?
Well, I mean, the political issues really weren't discussed, so I think that is what we should focus on. And I think if Joseph Kishore has his hand up, I think we should have a discussion. And if the people here feel that they haven't been able to say their piece, have another panel or something. Oh. But the SEP is no stranger to hit pieces. I mean, as I mentioned, they responded to a loyal comrade who'd worked with them loyally for quite a few years by calling him a quote-unquote agent of the union bureaucracy with zero evidence whatsoever. So how about the academic rigor or the intellectual rigor there? And not to mention all the other slanders against other former party members.
Okay.
I could just make a point since Peter referenced.
Yeah, Joseph, you haven't spoken. Why don't you speak?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the focus of this meeting is on the book by Beatty, and I think he does have an obligation to respond to the points that have been raised. And I think the dismissing of the critique of historians, Tom is not just a so-called historian, he is a historian who has researched this question and provided a detailed response as part of the writings on the World Socialist website. but I think he also has a responsibility to explain why it is that his work has been financed over a decade by Zionist organizations, and what the relationship between the biography of Beatty is, biography of Healey is to that. And I think he does have the responsibility not to simply dismiss such statements as, I believe he called them, stupid. It's just an invasion. I would just make a couple points in relationship to the Socialist Equality Party, as it has been referenced in the course of this meeting as well, and the claims of the supposedly anti-democratic character of the internal life. I should first of all preface this by making the point that these are made by, in addition to Beatty, who knows nothing about our organization, Alex Steiner, who was briefly, who was a member in the early mid 1970s, then left the party, then rejoined and left again after the split with Wohlforth. He later, in an application, frankly admitted to reapply later, which was not accepted. He frankly admitted that his distance from the party was due to the influence of his middle-class lifestyle. He now runs a blog which is devoted entirely to attacks on the International Committee, in which that is the only criteria for publication on his website.
That's a personal attack, Joseph. Can you explain why your history isn't on your website?
I'll address that. I just want to make the point. I'll address
that's a personal attack. There was some specific.
No, it's a political
questions.
Can you be quiet, Steve, and let Joe finish?
I'm sorry. It's not a person. It's a political characterization. But I just want to make the point about Peter Ross is that he was only a provisional member. Was never actually a member of the Socialist Equality Party. Bata, that he referenced, was expelled not because of his raising differences, but his refusal to operate in a principled manner in raising differences, in a disciplined manner, as anyone is expected to in a revolutionary organization. But the fundamental questions are political, and they have political differences. But the claim that either that the SEP is not democratic internally, or that it is not engaged in an intervention in the working class is absurd. There was actually reference to our campaign of Will Lehman in the UAW, in which we were the only political organization intervening against the bureaucracy and won very broad support. The Socialist Equality Party does, in fact, have a very broad following in the working class. And the assertions made by these ex-members who really know nothing about the internal life of the Socialist Equality Party are ridiculous. As for the history, there is no other political, your question, Steve, since you asked it, there is no other political organization that treats the history of its own movement as seriously as the Socialist Equality Party and fights for an understanding among its membership of that history. As to the specific issues of getting up the bulletin, I can assure you that the record of the Workers' League is discussed continuously in the Socialist Equality Party. We encourage all of our members to study the history of the Workers' League, all of the issues. Of course, there have been changes over the past period in how we approach certain questions bound up with our analysis of globalization, the changes in the capitalist mode of production. But we are incredibly proud of the history of the Workers' League, of all of its interventions in the working class struggle, of which I should add that Comrade David North played a leading role. That is not in any way downplayed within the Socialist Equality Party. Every single member is encouraged to study the entire history of our movement, of our international movement. And any member of the Socialist Equality Party will tell you exactly the same thing. There is no other political organization that treats its own history as seriously as the Socialist Equality Party. And that's precisely why we take this scurrilous hack job of Aidan Beatty so seriously, because that's what it's an attack on. It's an attack on our history, on the attack on the history of the Trotskyist movement, and we will not abide by that. And that's why we insist that all of our members study these questions.
Okay, so I want to close unless Aidan has any final comments. But the fact of the matter is, the history of Healey and the reason we're having this panel is not just to talk about the history of Healey. It's to talk about what we have to do today. And that is what we want to have a discussion about, in part, in looking at this history. And what was clearly shown today is that the issue of the united front against fascism, the issue of building a mass working class political alternative for workers in the United States and in Britain, is not on the agenda, in my view, for the SEP. They've abandoned the fight for a united front. There's no mention of it in the fight in the context of fascist government coming in. I find that very disturbing, very disturbing. There are going to be roundups. The FBI is going to be used in a major witch hunt. People are going to be jailed, imprisoned, political people all over the country. And yet, I think that there are some people here who are disconnected from that. In other words, they don't think we face an imminent threat of fascism. Now, that's a serious issue.
Who do you propose we form a united front?
That is not something that is unimportant. It's facing the working class in the United States and internationally. I think we need another discussion, but obviously we have a basic and fundamental difference about the present situation and what we really face. One little party is not going to be able to fight. Is not going to be able to fight a fascist.
What other website
I think that,
has covered so extensively the danger posed by Trump and Trumpism?
We're willing to have other panels, but that issue has to be addressed, and it is not being addressed. So by some people who are supporters of Gerry Healy. So I want to thank you all for joining us.
Since you raised a very critical question,
we will continue this discussion and debate. It obviously is not something that is finished by any means. So thank you all for joining us today.